Hello and welcome yet again, to Android Design in Action. As always, I'm Roman Nurik.
Hey guys, my name's Adam Koch.
And hi, my name's Nick Butcher.
And Nick is joining us from Mountain View today, not rainy London, since he's actually visiting the core Android developer relations team out in Mountain View. Nick, How is Mountain View?
I'm in San Francisco right now, so you get a nice
okay.
view of my hotel bedroom because it's like 7 a.m.
Nice. Well, thanks for joining so early in the morning, Nick. So today's episode of Android Design in Action we're going to talk about newsreaders. We're not going to look at any specific apps since we're still figuring out how we approach nominations for apps that want to get some redesigns. We'll be talking about kind of hypothetical stuff today for newsreaders, and then we'll jump into units of measures, specifically density independent pixels, as well as some layout grids and pixel grids and all sorts of fun stuff like that. With that, shall we get started?
Let's do it.
All right. So let's talk about newsreaders. So previously on Android Design in Action, I think a few months ago, maybe in January, we did we did an episode on iterative improvements, basically starting from a very bare bones newsreader type app. Basically had a list of very bacony articles and a detail section that let you kind of view the details or read that article. And we figured, why not just kind of use that as a starting point and see how we can improve on the reading experience from there. So here are some slides from the last episode of Android Design in Action. You can see that you have kind of this list of articles on the left, your news items. And then on a tablet, of course, you have this multi-pane UI where you have the list of articles on the left and then your details on the right. And then on a phone, you just have your details, usually a photo, a title, and then obviously the meat of the article, which is a big block of text.
Meat of the article, was that a joke?
So what? The meat of the. Oh, right.
Didn't even realize
I set a pun. I didn't even realize it. But yes.
Sorry.
Yes, exactly. So, and then we also did some alternatives where let's say you really want to focus on the photos. Here are some things you can do. You can make the photo kind of full bleed and let the article of the text be kind of an overlay on top of that. And there are a couple things that we talked about, including background protection with with dark gradients and things of that nature. So these are just two of the presentations that we threw together for details. So today I wanted to talk about, different or alternative presentations of these things, as well as enhancements, further iterative improvements on this experience that can really make news reading a pleasure. So let's jump into some of those. The first is, and this is actually, kind of a power user feature. Probably should have saved this for last, but back with Android 4.1, we provided this kind of new feature called expanded notifications, right? So you have your collapse notifications, and then with a two-finger gesture, you kind of pull down to expand the notification to see more details. With recent versions of Android, you can actually just use a single finger kind of to swipe down if there aren't that many notifications in the list. So one of the things that we were thinking about is, as you're browsing a set of stories, right? As you're browsing this list, oftentimes, you want to get a little more. You don't want to necessarily read the entire article or see everything. You just want to get a slightly larger preview. So, there are a couple of ways of doing that if that's of interest to you and your newsreader app. Obviously you could have, a button within that list item, like a preview button. You could potentially have like a long press preview or long press to show contextual action bar, and then you could have a preview there. But we thought this is kind of maybe a power user thing. Once you discover it, you start using it a little more. So why not use a power user gesture? So one way of doing this is, let's say you use your two fingers to scroll down or to swipe down on an article. You'd swipe down and then you'd start seeing the preview. So in this case, it's a video. The video maybe even starts playing inline automatically, and this is something that you can definitely do as of Android 4.0, or actually even Android 3.0. Actually, no, it's 4.0 that we had this thing called
4.0, yeah.
Yeah, texture view that lets you basically play, video or do lots of interesting things inside of, a graphical object that's composed with the rest of, your window. But the idea is that you could do cool things like play video in line. You could apply animations, transitions to video. But here's one example of where you can take video and make it in line. Alternatively, if you just have text or a photo, you can kind of as you swipe down to expand, you could show the text. Obviously, you could show photo, maybe even horizontally swipeable, unless you have another competing gesture for horizontal swipe. But it's just the idea that sometimes a simple little title that's probably ellipse-sized is just not enough. So this is kind of one way of doing that, of alleviating that.
It's a really fun power gesture. I like the use of it in the list context because, as you say, horizontal swipe is quite, competing for a lot of different gestures that are going on in space at the moment. So this is a really nice way to act on a single list item.
Yeah,
it's really good for power users, but then for users that want to browse normally, it doesn't sort of interfere with that flow either. They can just tap and move into the article as well.
Right. It's not like the only way of exposing the content, right? You can actually just touch to get to the content. That's the primary gesture involved there, but for the power users to discover it, this may be kind of an additional nice thing.
It probably bootstraps on the rich notification as well, right? You're probably going to show a similar amount of content as you might be preparing already and laying out for a rich notification, and then it builds on that same gesture, so you kind of bootstrap the kind of interaction, which is cool.
As an additional thing, maybe to kind of hint at the gesture, and this is something that we talked about a while ago with swipe to dismiss, right? With swipe to dismiss, you sometimes it's not necessarily a very, very discoverable gesture on its own, but let's say you kind of also provide the ability to long press on an object and then press a delete item in the contextual action bar and it kind of slides away. That kind of hints subtly that, hey, I can do that same thing with my finger, not necessarily just always use the delete action, the contextual action bar, but I can actually try this with my finger and it works. So in this case, what you could do is, as these list items populate, you could kind of animate them in. So start with a larger size, and then as they fall into place, they kind of like shrink into the collapsed size, just to hint that there's actually more under each list item and that you can get to it with your two-finger swipe. But lots of different things you can do here. The basic point is, make the news browsing experience great. Not only the news reading experience, but the news browsing experience. Along those same lines, I guess. Consider alternative presentations for your collection, right? So when you present a list of articles, or I guess a collection of articles, since it's not always a list, consider ways to make that a more richer, experience. So one of the things that we looked at in the past is Pocket, which switches from, on a phone it's a list, to on a 7-inch tablet it's a grid, to on a 10-inch tablet it's kind of like a staggered grid where a single cell can take multiple items or multiple columns. In that same vein, how can you make this a little more rich? So one of the alternatives obviously is, to make this, full bleed, or basically almost full bleed photos and just the text on top. And in cases where you don't have a photo, you could kind of use a standard background like that. This works really well for very, very graphically rich, news content pieces. Like, it doesn't really work so well for text, but certainly if you have lots of photos or videos, this is a good way of presenting it.
Yeah, one of our core design principles says that pictures are faster than words, and this is an excellent demonstration of it. If you have the imagery, then shout about it, make it as big as you can.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely frustrating when a news app has really great imagery, and then they have they even use this list view one, and they have tiny little images there. So, both of these presentations look really nice.
Yeah, tiny photos, that's definitely a pet peeve, especially on tablets. Like, such a beautiful screen, like a Nexus 10, right? Such a beautiful screen, and not using it to show photos if you have really high-res photos is kind of a missed opportunity. So,
on a side note to this pattern as well, one of the things I really like for using this pattern is the use of a zoom it up animation. If you click on one of the tiles to retain context, Android makes it really easy to kind of click on one of those squares and it zooms up, so the picture becomes the whole screen, and that's super simple to build. It's like 2 lines of code called activity options, and it really retains your context. You really kind of have that link between where you came from and where you're going to.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, moving on. The next thing we wanted to talk about was the very much commented or buzzed about navigation drawer pattern. So what you could do is, let's say you have an app that has lots of hierarchy. What you could do is you could have a spinner, right? You could have a drill down list navigation where basically you have when you first get to the app, you have a list of categories, and then you touch the category to get into the details of that. To see all the articles within that category. But what we've been using in some of our apps recently, and I'm sure all of you out there know, is this new pattern that we're calling the navigation jar. So the navigation jar is basically this thing that kind of slides out from the left. It's also called the sliding menu or the fly-in menu, and it can work really well where you have lots of sibling sections. It's really primarily for navigation. It can work really well when you have lots of adjacent sections that don't really work well as tabs, and maybe they're kind of too heavyweight for a spinner. And the other nice thing about the navigation jar. Sorry, go ahead, Nick.
Also, simply too many as well. I think a spinner you kind of start maxing out over 5, 6, 7 items, right?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we were thinking about, and this is something that comes up frequently, is what if I have a really, really deep, heavy hierarchy, right? So I have 10 or 20 top level sections, and then within each section I have 10 subsections or something. And this kind of, if you're a news organization, you probably have this. You probably have
it's pretty common across most news apps, right?
Yeah, and also sports leagues or any sort of sports tracking. You have a bunch of different leagues with different sub leagues and categorizations of league. It could be pretty heavyweight. So what we were thinking about is, and this is actually something that we've been recommending, is letting the user customize. So a good example of this is Currents. Google Currents, it has a list of kind of top level news categories like sports and business and things like that. But then within each section, you can actually customize which news sources you use. So we took this one step further. Let's let the user customize the entire left pane, right? So the navigation jar is kind of quick access, right? It's the top level of hierarchy. Let's give the user the full customization of that, right? So what you see here is an example of what you could do if you allow the user to customize. So at the very top, you see the user's kind of favorited or I guess favorited sections with this customize button that lets you change what's going on there. When you first open up the app, let's say you haven't used it yet, you'd probably just see customize, or you'd just see some pre-canned items.
Like top news or whatever.
Right, and then below that, like under more news or et cetera, you'd see kind of the things that everybody should see, things like saved stories, featured, top videos, whatever. It's really up to you. But at the very top is this kind of heavily customizable section. So let's take a look at, so this is pretty straightforward, but the more interesting part is the actual customize screen. So when you press customize, what do you see? This is an example of something you could build. So the first thing you want to do, and there's a couple of things, right? You want to be able to, this is basically like list management, right? You want to be able to delete items, you want to be able to reorder items, make things higher than others, and you want to obviously be able to add and search for things. So we've combined all of those different tasks into a single UI. So on the left, you can notice that you have these drag handles for reordering, and we've highlighted this before in previous episodes of the show. I think the one on shopping lists or something like that. And then you can also remove items using the standard kind of swipe to dismiss. We also talked about, well, we just mentioned swipe to dismiss may not be super discoverable. You can absolutely also offer like contextual action. So if I long press on like the search for Android or long press on food and health, it'll select those items and I'll press delete and it'll get them out of the way. You should also support undo, right? So if that does happen, show the user the option to undo what they did, either contextually in line with the item or as that bottom bar that we've shown before. Additionally, another important part of this is adding, right? Adding a topic or searching for a topic. And this is where, I think the bulk of this UI, is different from other current interactions. Oh, sorry. So the idea is that you have a lot of hierarchy, and one of the best ways to kind of flatten hierarchy is through search, right? So you can obviously let the user drill down into different levels of hierarchy, and that can be tedious, but sometimes it's warranted. So for that, you kind of would always see this browse for more or browse item. So as soon as you kind of give focus to this add a topic text field, you should see this kind of browse, right? But as soon as you start typing in this text field, it does a kind of a global search across all of the different categories and subcategories and subcategories. And it basically very easily lets you find what you're doing without having to drill down, find what you want without having to drill down. The other thing is, obviously ranking is important here. Just a brief note about ranking. You want to make sure that you would, if you do kind of use this kind of UI, you want to make sure that you kind of rank deeper matches higher than kind of lower level matches or higher level matches. So like if you have something like sports and then soccer, if you're typing SOC, it should rank higher than like top social stories SOC there. The reason for that is that it's more pertinent, it's more detailed. So you always want to show the more detailed information on top. So that's at a very in a very fast way of explaining this. That's roughly what this works like or looks like. Do you guys have any other suggestions or other ways in which you can potentially expose this kind of large hierarchy?
Well, you commented on it earlier on, but I think in the shopping episode we did a while back, you had a really interesting presentation, an alternative to this, where instead of having the search, you had like a list of articles and you had a little view icon. You could like toggle it to viewed state. So that would be an alternative presentation if you didn't have such a very, very deep hierarchy and you wanted to be able to present them to the user to kind of give them the knowledge of what there is available. What I really like about this presentation with the search is not only is it kind of easier to navigate a very large structure, but it also makes it feel more like mine. The idea of like presenting me some a given list and then toggling it, is very much kind of here's the things available to you. Whereas search is like here's the things I want. It's kind of a bit more personal to me. I like it. And I also very much like the customized behavior. I think too many people see navigation as a way to dump to advertise every single feature the app offers, but having this very, very small list makes it again more relevant. So that harks back to our design principles: show me only what I need when I need it, which I really, really like.
Yeah, it's just a way to kind of combat very heavy navigation drawers. And anytime you have navigation, you want to make it as light as possible, right? You don't want to overburden the user with stuff that they have to think about before they actually get to their content, right? So this is just one of the easy ways of doing that.
I think when everyone's using a news app, you never really, not all the sections are relevant to you, so it's just really nice to be able to bubble them up quickly. And if the hierarchy is really, really deep and really broad, then it's just hard to find those items that you want to add into your favorites. I actually haven't seen that many news apps that really, really nail that sort of flow of adding different topics to your favorites list.
Mm-hmm.
Just a couple of notes again on the slide and draw. I know we talked about this quite a lot in our design hangout too, but just while we're here, a couple of things I really like about this is you can see that as the drawer opens, we change the screen title and drop the up caret, and also drop that refresh icon. So it's really important that you keep the action bar in place, but you can dynamically adjust its options to make it appropriate to when you have your major navigation sections open. And I think another great thing, talking about that two-finger swipe down, is because we're not reserving a horizontal gesture on the list view type screen, it means you could do a whole content swipe to open this drawer. So it makes the drawer that much more discoverable. So you don't have to just do an edge type swipe. You could swipe from anywhere horizontally within the page and find the drawer, which is going to help your users get to know the app.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We should push on. We're running low.
Yeah, that's true. That clock is probably wrong. Okay, so let's. We talked about that. Very quickly, I wanted to talk about some very last items here. So the other thing you want to obviously optimize is the article reading experience. There's one of the ways in which you could look at this is there's a beginning of the article, a middle of the article where you're kind of focusing on the content, and then the end of the article where you're kind of winding down. So in the beginning of the article, you want to see everything. You want to see the action bar. You want to see the title, potentially share options if like immediately you want to share something. But once you start reading, once you start scrolling down, one of the things that you could do is you can actually, first of all, go into lights out mode where the status bar and navigation bar kind of get into a dimmed state. And potentially the action bar can hide, right? And this is kind of similar to the quick return pattern where you start scrolling down, maybe a few hundred pixels or so, or a few hundred dips, and the action bar kind of slides out of the way for you. And then as soon as you start scrolling back up, you may be kind of going backwards. You may want to see other options, so you can show the action bar again. This could also be coupled with touch to toggle the action bar. So lots of different things you could do here. But the idea is that if the user doesn't really care about the actions in that specific context of reading the text, you don't necessarily need to show it always. And then once you get to the end of the article, the action bar should slide back in because it has that kind of key share action. And you see here the presentation with the share action provider that gives you the most frequently used or most recently used shared destination. And then you also see things like the comments, obviously. More in this section, you see here, we kind of expose a little bit of that hierarchy, and then related stories. And the idea here is, the only real point here is that you don't want to have the entire experience end there. If there are things that the user can really benefit from at the end of this detail item, related items or other things, expose them right there so that they don't have to press back, right? The best experience is when you don't actually have to press back or up or anything. It's just kind of a continual flow, right? You kind of flow through the app. So definitely consider doing this if you have the opportunity to expose related items and things like that. Before we jump into the next section, any last comments on newsreaders or anything?
No, that looks great.
I think we should get going.
All right, let's do it. So let's jump into units of measure. Adam, Nick, do you guys want to take on units of measure?
Sure.
So screen variations, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're talking about designing for Android and the wealth of different screens out there, there's a few things you have to think about when you talk about different types of screen, and the one that most people tend to lock onto is resolution, right? It's a very well understood measure, especially coming from the desktop world. But when we're talking about mobile, where devices have this vastly different densities of screen, resolution actually turns out to be not that useful number in its kind of raw numbers. Like if you look at a 2 10-inch tablets like the Motorola Xoom and the Nexus 10 have vastly different resolutions, 4 times the number of pixels in the Nexus 10, but they're pretty much very similar screens when you're going to design the content that's going to go onto it, right? So it turns out that resolution isn't as interesting as talking about size and density. So luckily, Android has embraced this from the very start, and we have this concept, this kind of abstraction layer, if you want, called this density-independent pixel. So what this is, as we said here on the slide, is a density-independent pixel, or DP, or just generally say DIP. A DIP is a unit of measure which keeps things physically the same size across various different screens. So, things are certain, sizes, like a finger is 7 millimeters big on average or something like that. So you want to size your user interface elements so that they're kind of roughly the same physical size across devices, so that they're easy to tap, easy to see, and so forth. So by using this kind of virtualized unit, this DIP, you don't have to worry about how many pixels the screen actually lights up to display it. You just kind of size it for this right kind of virtual size, and the screen will take care of it.
Just one thing I wanted to mention real quick is that the core takeaway, I think, from the rest of this, if you're going to take one thing away, is that as somebody that's working with layout, or as somebody that's working with interaction design, just forget about pixels. Pixels don't matter, right? For visual design, pixels matter, but for layout design, interaction design, pixels just don't matter, because dips are kind of the way in which you kind of make this entire world of designing for different densities sane.
Yeah, we'll pick up on that. It's kind of you kind of sacrifice a little bit of precise control in order for sanity for dealing with this vast array of different devices out there. So yeah, in the example here, we've shown you have a XHDPI device which might use 400 pixels to display an item, and a MDPI device which might actually use 200 pixels, but they're both the same physical size, this 200 dip measure. Whereas we showed the wrong device in that picture. Oh well.
Yeah, it's worth noting, the Xoom is a device that's MDPI, so we've got a Nexus 10 there, which is actually XHDPI.
And the Nexus S is HDPI, not XHDPI, but just forget about the frame. All right, should we move on to the next slide? On calculating dips. You want to talk about calculating dips?
Yeah, so the sort of baseline dip value is what we call MDPI, or 160 DPI. So this is sort of equation that you can use to calculate pixels and dips and the sort of conversion between them all. So you can basically take the DPI of a device. So it may be 160, but it could be something else. It could, for example, be HDPI or XHDPI. You divide it by the baseline, which is 160, and then that gives you your ratio of pixels to dips. So just so, I don't know if I fumbled any wording there, but don't forget there's DPI and there's dip. So they're very closely related. One is the actual density of the device, and the other is these dip units that we're talking about. So, so hopefully I didn't fumble anything.
DPI is dots per inch, or PPI, pixels per inch, and then you have dips, which is density independent pixels.
So I think we've got some sample calculations here.
Hammer this home.
Sorry?
Just to hammer this home.
Yeah, I guess we've got to move pretty fast here. So, of course, if the DPI of the device is 160, which is the standard, then 1 pixel equals 1 dip. Straightforward. If the density of the device is 320, so double the sort of standard baseline of 160, then one dip will equate to 2 pixels.
Yeah.
We're zooming
if you're coming from an iOS world, that's kind of similar to like the Retina is like at 2x, is like RX HDPI.
Right.
Yeah.
So just one example, this is actually something that we've asked anytime we've talked about dips in presentations. We've asked this question. So if you look at the Nexus 7 screen resolution, 1280 by 800, right? It's actually the same as the Motorola Zoom's screen resolution, 1280 by 800, and very similar to the Galaxy Nexus and the Nexus 4's screen resolution, 1280 by something, 768, 720. But its dip resolution is very different. So if you plug in these values, the fact that the Nexus 7 is 213 DPI and 1280 by 800, you'll actually find that its dip resolution is roughly 960 by 600 dips, and that kind of helps you figure out how much content will fit into this space,
How
right?
much screen real estate is really available for you to work with here?
Yeah, so when you think about screen real estate, like definitely don't think in pixels, think in dips. Okay, so yes, Nexus 7 about 960 by 600 dips. And if you're doing any sort of development, a lot of our qualifiers like smallest width, width and height, a lot of the resource qualifiers that you use are based on this resolution, not the pixel resolution. So make sure that you use this resolution when looking at the the screen real estate available on a device. So with grids, let me just briefly talk about some of the grids that you should be using when you're doing layout. So once you kind of are in this world of dips, after that you kind of need to start thinking about laying out your elements. So obviously on Android you want to make sure that you use constraint-based layout. So don't say this should be exactly 200 dips or this should be exactly 300, and that'll roughly fill the space. Make sure that you're using things like this should be 20% of the screen or 20% of the available real estate. And then make sure that you're using constraint-based layout as well. Like this should be to the right of this, and this should be below that. But also, you want to use some basic sizes. So two of the things that we generally recommend using, and two of the things that we document on developer.android.com/design, are 48 dip rhythm, which basically says that roughly both vertically and horizontally, you should try to structure items around 48 dips in width and height. Especially touch targets. Touch targets, the minimum size should really be 48 dips. But 48 dips, 96 dips, multiples of 48, things like that work well. But with the things like spacing and margins and padding, you want to try to use roughly like a 4-dip grid. So what that means is that the very smallest size or amount of space between two items should be about 4 dips or 0, right? If it's completely flush. But also it means that you should use multiples of 4 as things like margins. So the margins around your screen should be like 16 dips or 32 dips. And then in some cases, you want to use like 8 dip spacers. So what I generally do as a designer is I use 4 dips very rarely. I use mostly either 0, 8, or 16 as my primary paddings. And then on tablets, I actually use larger ones, so like 16 or 32 or things like that. So in general, think in terms of multiples of 4, and then think about this 48 dip rhythm where everything should really just align to multiples of 48 in a perfect world.
I don't think we picked up on it, but a lot of the system UI will use this 48 dip rhythm. So that if you've got software navigation like on a Nexus 4, we have the back and home buttons at the bottom. That's 48 dips high. The action bar is 48 dips high. So kind of falling into the rhythm of this layout means your app will kind of fit in with the rhythm of the page. Kind of Gestalt principles.
Yeah. All right, let's move on. So here's just an example of some of our layouts. Nick, do you want to talk about the red lines?
Yeah, so as you were saying earlier, when you're talking about layout, when you're talking about what you're going to put on a page, you want to forget about physical pixels and you want to work in dips. So say you want to prepare a layout for like a 10-inch type device, that size of screen, then you don't want to think about the raw pixels. You want to create your canvas that you're using in Illustrator or Photoshop or Fireworks or whatever it might be to the dip size, and work at this baseline resolution of dip size. So then when you do your layout, like the red line like we're showing here, the items like 1 pixel therefore translates straight into 1 dip. So it's really, really easy to kind of do your layout at this dip resolution and then communicate that to your developers. Hand them these red lines and show them that these are the sizes and dips that things need to be.
It also works well with like redlining tools. There are some tools for Fireworks, like Inspector or Spectre, something like that. that actually create these red lines for you. Not these exact ones, but the good thing is that if you work with 1 pixel equals 1 dip in that baseline density, then it kind of uses the correct values. So you don't have to do any sort of like doubling or halving or anything.
Yeah. So the thing we're kind of hammering home here is layout is dips. Forget about physical pixels. Layout equals dips.
Yeah, people said it about 5 times.
Yeah, one slight, I guess, if we're going to go on to the next slide, one slight, variation on dips is when we're talking about text sizing. So this is very closely related to dips, but we have to introduce, the ability, the user has the ability to scale the text up and down as a user preference. It's really a kind of an accessibility feature. So, some users just need to have larger text. So whenever you're sizing any text for your layouts, you need to be using this SP unit, the scale independent pixel. If the users kind of not change their kind of scale, then 1 SP will equal 1 DP. But you need to bear in mind that the user can bump that both up and down. So you kind of get like into scale of like, what is it, like 1.2x or 1.4x the size if you're bumping it up, or it might be slightly smaller. So you need to respect that user's chosen setting and scale your units, your text in SPs.
Yeah, so that means if you actually have like 2 content blocks, right, like 2 pieces of text that are adjacent, you want to make sure that the spacing between them, for example, scales with the text size. You also want to use SP units for the margins, for example. Generally, we use SP units for text size attributes, but they're useful in other cases when you want to be very cognizant of spacing between text and things like that.
It's a good way to test your app, right? If you're worried about, you want to test your layouts to the extreme, then change the language to German and put the scaling feature up to maximum and see how your layout handles it.
So we got to fly through the rest. I think we're about 11, but let's fly through. So
last, I was going to say though, so yeah, when we're talking about layout, then you want to forget about physical pixels. But when we're talking about bitmap assets, then you absolutely need to think in pixels. So the only thing that changes when you go from something like the Zoom to the Nexus 10, which has the same kind of layout size in dips, is you need your assets to be crisp, right? If you were just to use the exact same assets from an MDPI device on an XHDPI device, then they'll be super blurry. So this is where we introduce this concept of density buckets. It lets you not think about raw density, but kind of group them together into these kind of logical densities here. So as we've talked about all along, we have this MDPI bucket, or 160 DPI is our baseline, kind of where all the first Android devices came out. And slowly that's kind of drifted upwards until we're at the range now where XHDPI is kind of like the norm on most phones, and XX seems to be perhaps coming in. So the idea here is that if you have an icon like we show here in the right-hand column, which needs to be 32 by 32 dips, on an MDPI device that would translate into 32 by 32 pixels, but on an XHDPI device that would actually turn out to be 64 by 64 pixels. So you have complete control over a pixel-perfect icon on an XHDPI device. You can draw it at 64 by 64, and then the device will pick the right density version at runtime.
All right.
And
go ahead.
The DPI buckets highlighted in bold, just quickly here. There's sort of the key density buckets, so you should generally provide all your assets in those densities. The other ones are sort of less common, but you may potentially want to provide key assets in those densities as well. It's sort of your call there, especially XHDPI for your launcher icon. Mm-hmm. All right, let's go.
So a lot of people ask, can I just provide the highest density ones and have Android, scale it down and so forth? And that is something you can do. There's a slight performance. It's not huge, but it's something to be aware of. And Roman's going to come back to talk about some techniques you can use to actually, do this a little bit more smartly. But just moving forward to the next slide. This is the kind of concept I want to talk about. Is that you don't really want to design your application, specifically around a certain device, because the device landscape is changing all the time, and it's kind of you end up chasing your own tail. So using these techniques of only thinking in dips for layout and only thinking about density for pixel assets, for bitmap assets, is your route to happiness for future devices. So the example we kept on going back to here is if you had provided a layout for something like the Motorola Zoom, the first generation of Android tablets that came out, which was like 1280 by 800, and you had provided XHDPI, these kind of high density bitmap assets for something like the Galaxy Nexus, all of a sudden when a device like the Nexus 10 comes out, which you might not have heard about a year ago when you did this, it'll pick the same layouts as the Motorola Zoom. It'll pick the high density bitmap assets from the phones, and it'll put them together and have this optimized looking layout and clear assets. So it's a really, really nice system to be able to think about these two things separately.
Mm-hmm. Moving on, really quick pixel grid tips. So when you're doing asset production, this is actually one general tip, and you can kind of tweak this as you see fit. One thing that I generally do is use a 4-pixel grid for designing assets, and I start with XHDPI. So you can see here, starting with XHDPI, lining things up to a 4-pixel grid means that you can actually then scale down to HDPI, MDPI, and I'm not sure about LDPI, but probably LDPI as well, and get really, really crisp borders. So this is actually something that we do in our system assets. So if you look at the default button asset, the kind of the pressed state for the button, you'll notice that the size of the kind of glow around the core shape is 8 pixels. And the reason for that is that, the reason it's not 7 pixels or 5 pixels is that it scales down really, really nicely. So this is just kind of a quick tip if you're doing asset production. Aligning to a 4-pixel grid is really, really useful for scaling down. Okay, so that was it for units of measure. We flew through that, and there's still, we're still over time. Let's really briefly talk about design news. Actually, anything before we jump into that, any kind of parting thoughts on pixels and dips and things like that? No?
Layouts, dips, always use them together.
Yeah, layouts and dips. Okay, so design news. The first is we actually have a New York Android designers meetup coming up next week. This is the very first meetup, and we're hoping to have multiple of these meetups over the next few months. I don't know how frequently we'll do it, but definitely something that we're starting up now. This is actually run by Paul Burke from the Android Designers Google Plus community. So if you're in New York or the general area and you're free next Thursday at around, I forgot what time, like 6:30 or 7 p.m. Eastern, then visit this link and we'll see you there.
Looks like we lost Nick there.
Oh, it looks like we lost Nick in the hangout. Okay. Thanks, Pete. Pete's producing. Thanks, Pete. And the last item in our design news is the Android UI design kit. So Taylor Ling kind of has this design kit that's kind of like a nice starting point, a nice template for doing sorts of visual designs. And if you're interested in doing this, and I don't know which devices he has, but probably like various devices. If you're kind of interested in getting a nice, easy starting point with a couple of patterns already, pre-packaged in there, then this is a nice starter kit. I think we see ourselves twice now. It's kind of cool. There's Nick.
This is what we get for going over time.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's kind of his updated version of the UI design kit. All right, and I think that's it for the content today. Any parting thoughts, fellas? No? Nick is still super frozen. That's hilarious. Okay, well, thanks again for joining Android Design in Action. I'm your host, Roman Nurik.
Adam Koch, and over in Mountain View we have Nick Butcher, who is frozen right now.
Absolutely frozen.
Thanks, guys. See you next week.
Thanks. See ya.
Bye.